In today's video, we're going to be talking about these guys and what set of powers they have as leaders of the executive branch. But before we begin, allow me to preface today's video with this. Conversations about presidents in general, and particularly our current one, are often met with irrational reactions and lack of level-headed thinking before speaking. This video is not designed to share political beliefs at all. It's designed to educate you on the branch of government that the president works in, regardless of who they are and what they choose to do with the power that they're given. As we learn about the executive branch, and as you continue learning about the world around you, I encourage you to keep an open mind and practice forming your own opinions rather than following the ones that cause the least amount of problems. But let's get on to our video with a quick recap about what we learned yesterday. The legislative branch is in charge of making the laws and consists of the Senate and the House of Representatives, who do just that. They represent the citizens of America. And so in a nice neat package, this legislative branch is like the paper to the executive branch's rock in this big old governmental rock, paper, scissors game. And speaking of the executive branch, we know that this is the one with the president in it. And before getting too much into the text, the main responsibility of this branch of government is to execute the law or to carry it out. And just from your own background knowledge about the subject, you might be thinking that the President of the United States has a ton of power. Which is sort of true, but because King George III royally messed things up during the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers changed things up a bit for the future leaders of our new country. The delegates who wrote the Constitution did not want the United States to have a leader with too much power, like a king. So they limited the president's power. For example, the Constitution gives the president the power to either sign or veto the bills passed by Congress. However, Congress can overrule the president's veto by a 2/3 vote of both houses. And this was the concept that we sort of touched upon in yesterday's video. Just because Congress makes a law and it seems like such a sure thing that it'll happen, it's ultimately up to the president to say yes or no. And the word veto in your text is basically the official government way of saying no to a bill and rejecting it, causing it to go back to square one. But as we also learned in yesterday's video, just because a president vetoes a bill doesn't necessarily mean it's dead in the water. Congress can then overrule that decision as long as the House of Representatives and the Senate both have a 2/3 vote for it. But here's a question one might have. If the president is in charge of the United States, shouldn't he be allowed to make laws? It's a fair question to have, but remember, the Founding Fathers didn't want to give too much power to the leader of the new country. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the president is completely powerless in these situations. Presidents cannot make laws or introduce bills into Congress, but they can lead the country by making proposals or offering ideas to Congress. One way that the presidents do this is by giving a State of the Union speech every year to both houses in the House chamber. In these speeches, they may suggest ideas for new laws. The important thing to note here is that just because a president offers an idea for a law doesn't actually mean it will happen, because remember, Congress is the one that makes the laws. This was another way that the Founding Fathers balanced the power among the government officials. So about the State of the Union speech. This speech by the president happens every year, and in addition to proposing new ideas sometimes, it also allows the president to provide an update on how the country is running. Think of this as something similar to the Monday morning announcements that happened at school, except way more important. At times, the president may also use another set of powers and call a special meeting with Congress in order to declare a national emergency, similar to how George W. Bush did so in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. And these emergencies can deal with all sorts of issues both internally and externally, so let's take a look at how the president deals with things outside the borders of the United States. The president shares power over foreign affairs with Congress. The president can sign a treaty with another nation, but 2/3 of the Senate must approve it. As commander-in-chief, the president is in charge of the nation's armed forces such as the Army and Navy, but only Congress can declare war. This is yet another example of how all three branches of government are intertwined in order to prevent too much power leaning one way or the other. Because of yesterday's video, we learned that Congress is the one that makes the treaties and declares war. And even if the president wants these things to happen, Congress still needs a 2/3 majority vote. And another ability that the president has, yet still needs the Congress approval, is that of picking his co-workers. Yesterday we briefly went over what that concept was because we were saving it for today's video. So let's take a look at what the text says and then we'll add a little bit more onto it. As chief executive, the president nominates or suggests people for key jobs in the government. For example, the president nominates cabinet members, ambassadors, and federal judges. However, the Senate has to accept or reject the president's choices. So what's the deal with this cabinet thing? Well, by definition, it's the group of people specifically chosen by the president to fill in the necessary roles of leadership within all the various departments of the executive branch. The very first cabinet in existence of our government was led by George Washington, and he only had 5 people, including himself, in it. Now, our president's cabinet has up to 15 members. But it sort of makes sense because our society has grown over the last 200 years. As far as where the word cabinet came from, I did some research and came up with that it was a French term for a small room, so I guess it sort of makes sense because this is a small group of leadership within a larger group of the government. But anyway, we have one last set of powers to explain before we move on to our notes. And it has to do with punishments, but we're only going to briefly touch upon it because that's the topic of tomorrow's video. The president has the power to grant pardons, or a release from punishment, to people who have been found guilty of crimes against the nation, but the president cannot give pardons in cases of impeachment. The number of people pardoned in this century alone is well into the thousands, and so it kind of makes things a little tricky to simplify for you. And obviously each case presents a unique situation as to why or why not the person was pardoned. But also, don't you find it a little concerning how high that number is based on what we just read? There's a very good reason why the third branch of government is in place. But like I said, we'll talk about that tomorrow. For now though, open up those workbooks to page 87, and we're going to do the same thing we did yesterday, filling in those 3 categories, except this time with the executive branch. And don't forget, that pause button actually works, so don't be afraid to use it while you're writing these things down so you don't miss anything. Alright, so we're looking at the executive branch here. The main responsibility of this branch is to carry out the laws that the legislative branch makes. The main person that does this is the President of the United States, along with a few other government officials in the presidential cabinet. The following is a list of some of the powers the president has. He can sign or veto any bills passed by Congress. He can make proposals for new laws in the State of the Union speeches. And in case of emergency, the president can also call the Congress together for special meetings. The president can sign treaties with foreign countries and is also the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. Before Congress confirms the selections, the president can nominate judges, ambassadors, and cabinet members. The president can also grant pardons. And lastly, the president represents our country in foreign affairs, which means that he is the main person that communicates with other countries around the world. So as you can see, yeah, the president does have a lot of power, but remember, the founding fathers wanted to limit it so that they didn't have another King George on their hands. Tomorrow we're going to be learning about this third branch of government here and how it's connected to the other 2 we've already learned about. But guys, that's going to do it for today's Daily Dose of History. Be sure to head back to our Google Classroom and answer our question of the day. And just a heads up, you already know that our States and Capitals quiz is next week on May 29th. Also happening next week, your Chapter 14 test, which is on May 28th. And so on May 27th, we'll be having our Zoom review sessions, so be on the lookout for that as I send those invitations out next week. But that's all for now, so I'll see you right here tomorrow.